A man with $400 million in the bank should not be choking to death on a Tuesday night. But Raymond Holt was, and every physician in the room was utterly useless. Holt had built Holt Capital Group from a borrowed desk in a Philadelphia row house into one of the most feared private equity firms on the eastern seaboard. He was 61 years old, built like a retired linebacker, gone soft around the middle, and possessed of the particular brand of confidence that only decades of making other men's companies disappear could manufacture. He did not lose. He did not apologize. He certainly did not show weakness in front of the man sitting across from him at the finest table in Aurelius, Boston's most legendarily impenetrable fine dining institution. That man was Sterling Vaux, the 68-year-old patriarch of Vaux Global Holdings, a Singapore-based infrastructure conglomerate that had spent 40 years quietly acquiring toll roads, deep water ports, and water treatment facilities across 3 continents. Vaux had the manners of an English boarding school and the patience of a man who had never once needed to hurry for anything in his life. He had flown in from Geneva specifically for this dinner. The acquisition that Holt Capital was proposing, a $2.3 billion takeover of a struggling South American port consortium, required Vaux's co-signature, his network, and his blessing. Tonight was the night Raymond Holt intended to close it. Beneath his custom-tailored jacket, his diaphragm was already beginning its terrible, familiar rebellion. The episodes had begun 14 months ago, after a bout of what his internist had breezily diagnosed as a severe respiratory infection. The infection had cleared. The spasms had not. Without warning, at intervals that followed no discernible logic, the muscles, controlling his breathing, would seize in a grinding, convulsive wave. His airways would constrict. The world would go grey at the edges. His private physician, Dr. Aldous Price, had assembled a consultation of 8 specialists from 3 countries. They had subjected Holt to every scan, every scope, every pharmacological trial available to a man who could personally fund a hospital wing. The consensus was a vague, shameful, unsatisfying diagnosis, idiopathic spasmodic dysphonia complicated by diaphragmatic myoclonus. In plain language, they did not know why it was happening, and they could not make it stop. Dr. Price attended every significant social and professional engagement Holt had, seated unobtrusively at the edge of the room, a medical bag resting against his ankle, a loaded syringe of intravenous diazepam prepared in a padded case. Holt despised the arrangement. He despised needing it. He had, on 3 separate occasions, screamed at Price in private that the syringe was a crutch, that the entire situation was a humiliation, that a man who had restructured 17 failing corporations in 8 years was not going to be defeated by his own ribcage. Price, a small, fastidiously dressed man of 53 with a patchy beard and a habit of never meeting anyone's eyes directly, said very little in response to these outbursts. He simply repacked his bag and returned the following morning. Standing outside the burnished copper doors of Aurelius's private dining salon, the Tuesday evening, was Rosalind Faye. At 29, Rosalind had learned to make herself invisible. It was the primary skill the job required, and she had mastered it the way she had mastered most things, by studying the mechanics underneath until the execution felt effortless. She wore the Aurelius uniform, a pressed white shirt, high-waisted black trousers, a discreet gold name tag that the management had misspelled for 3 months before she stopped correcting them. Her dark hair was twisted into a low knot at the base of her neck. Her hands, which had once spent long hours in biochemistry labs at Northwestern University, now carried plates of food that cost more than her weekly take-home. She had not planned for this to be her life. 2 years into her graduate program in pharmacology, her mother, Doris, had been diagnosed with a progressive autoimmune condition that attacked the connective tissue surrounding her joints and, eventually, her lungs. The disease was manageable. Not curable, but manageable. With the right specialist, the right infusion protocol, the right medication regimen adjusted quarterly as her body's chemistry shifted. All of it was expensive. None of it, in any configuration of their insurance plan, was adequately covered. Her younger brother, Eli, was 16 and had no business becoming the sole caretaker of their mother at home while Rosalind sat in a lecture hall 3 states away. She had taken a leave of absence that had stretched in the particular way that necessary compromises always did, into something permanent. Aurelius paid well for a restaurant job. The gratuities in the private dining salon were extraordinary on the nights the room was booked by the city's financial elite. Rosalind had learned the wine list, the sourcing of every protein on the menu, the names and proclivities of the regular clientele. She was good at the job in the same way she was good at everything. Precisely, quietly, without calling attention to herself. She was not supposed to be in the private salon tonight. The senior server assigned to the Holt party had gone home at 5 o'clock with what he described, somewhat melodramatically, as a stomach situation. The floor manager had looked at the schedule, looked at the empty slot, and looked at Rosalind, who had been in the middle of rolling silverware in the prep kitchen, and who had not said a word in protest when he told her she was taking the room. She needed the money. She always needed the money. Inside the salon, Raymond Holt was telling Sterling Vaux about the operational efficiencies of the Port Consortium, with the controlled enthusiasm of a man performing normalcy against the backdrop of creeping physical dread. He lifted his wine glass, a 2017 Barolo that Aurelius charged $420 per bottle for, and felt the familiar, hateful prickling at the base of his sternum. The muscles beneath his ribs were tightening incrementally, the way they always did in the 10 or 15 minutes before a full episode. Sometimes the episodes passed. Sometimes they did not. The uncertainty was its own kind of suffering. Rosalind moved through the room collecting the first course plates with practiced precision. She approached Holt's side of the table and registered, before anything else, the quality of his breathing. It was a reflex she had developed over 2 years of watching her mother. The way the body telegraphs distress before the mind has decided to acknowledge it. Holt's inhalations were too shallow and slightly too frequent. The fine skin at his temples was damp. His left hand, resting beside his dessert fork, had the faintest tremor running through the knuckle of his index finger. She set her tray down at the credenza and returned to the kitchen for the second course. She flagged nothing. She said nothing. But she kept watching. The episode arrived without ceremony, the way a power outage arrives. One moment there is light, and the next there is none. Holt had been mid-sentence, describing the projected tonnage capacity of the primary berth at Puerto Esperanza, when his vocal cords simply locked. The sound that came out of him was not a cough, and not a word, and not quite a gasp. It was a strangled, involuntary bark, wet and wrong, and it turned every head in the room. Sterling Vaux set down his fork with a precise, unhurried motion and said, very calmly, "Raymond." Holt could not answer. His hand flew to his collar. He yanked at the Windsor knot, with fingers that had gone cold and clumsy, tore the button beneath it free, and then both hands pressed flat against the table as though he could push air into his own lungs from the outside. His face, already high in color from the wine and the warmth of the room, was cycling rapidly through red toward something deeper and more frightening. Dr. Price was on his feet before the security detail had registered what was happening. He was at Holt's side in 4 steps, his hand on the man's shoulder, his voice low and professionally neutral. "Raymond, eyes on me. Try to slow it down." Holt could not slow it down. Holt could not do anything. The spasm had fully engaged now, and his chest was heaving with effort while producing almost no result, the muscles working violently against an airway that had simply refused to open. The sound of it, that horrible, thin, reedy squeal of air trying to force itself through a locked throat, filled the quiet room like an alarm. "I need him still," Price said to the security guard, a broad man named Curtis who had spent 12 years doing executive protection and whose primary professional skill was reading a room. "Hold his shoulders. If he's thrashing, I cannot place the IV." Curtis moved. Rosalind, who had been standing near the doorway with the second course tray, set it down. She had watched this exact sequence play out on her mother's bedroom floor at 2 in the morning once, during a particularly acute episode of diaphragmatic involvement in the 3rd year of the disease. She had stood in the doorway then, 19 years old and terrified, while the paramedic crew worked. She had not stood in the doorway since. In the 4 years since she had studied, she had read everything she could access about spasmodic respiratory crises, airway dysfunction, and vagal nerve involvement, because knowledge was the only thing that transformed terror into action, and she had refused, categorically, to be terrified and helpless again in the same moment simultaneously. She recognized what Holt was experiencing with the particular certainty of someone who has seen the thing and read the thing and turned it over in her mind until its outlines were completely familiar. This was not anaphylaxis. This was not a cardiac event. The musculature involved, the specific sound of the restricted airway, the conscious distress without loss of cognitive function. This was a severe laryngospasm with secondary diaphragmatic involvement. Dr. Price had the prepared syringe in his hand. Rosalind crossed the room. She did not ask permission. She stepped between Curtis and the crouching physician and said, in a tone she did not raise, but that carried across the room with absolute clarity, "Don't give him that." Price looked up. His expression was not startled. It was contemptuous. "Excuse me, that's a benzodiazepine." She had seen the prepared case when Price had opened it 2 minutes earlier, the labeled syringe visible in its foam housing. His respiratory drive is already suppressed from the spasm. A central nervous system depressant at this stage doesn't stop the laryngospasm. It stops the compensatory effort. He'll lose the reflex that's keeping him alive. "You are a server," Price said, with the particular precision of a man who has selected the most dismissive possible description from a range of available options. "Step back. She's right." The voice came from Sterling Vaux, who had risen from his chair and moved to the end of the table. He was looking at Rosalind with the expression of a man who has spent a lifetime evaluating credibility and has not yet made up his mind. Let her speak. Holt's lips had begun to take on a greyish cast. Rosalind dropped to her knees on the carpeted floor beside him. "I need you to stay, blink twice, if you can hear me." 2 blinks, slow and effortful, from eyes that were wild with the animal panic of suffocation. "You're not going to lose consciousness," she said, and she was not certain that was true, but she said it with certainty because certainty was what he needed to hear. "I'm going to apply pressure to a specific point. It's going to hurt. Don't pull away from it." She placed her hands on either side of his jaw. The technique she was about to use, firm, targeted compression at the retromandibular fossa, the small depression directly behind the angle of the jawbone and below the earlobe, worked by sending an intense afferent signal along the glossopharyngeal nerve, creating a stimulus strong enough to interrupt the vagal feedback loop that was sustaining the spasm. It was not in common use. It was not taught in standard first aid. She had read about it in a research paper on pediatric airway emergencies, at 3 in the morning, sitting on the kitchen floor of her mother's apartment, after the paramedic visit that had shaken her so badly. She had not slept for 36 hours. She pressed. The pressure required was more than most people expected. It was not gentle. Holt made a sound that was half groan and half something that had no name, his body fighting the instinct to pull away, and Rosalind held on with both hands and increased the force. The grandfather clock in the corner of the salon ticked. Sterling Vose stood without moving. Curtis held Holt's shoulders. Dr. Price remained kneeling, the syringe in his hand, his mouth partially open. 4 seconds. Then Holt's body jolted, a single violent convulsion of the chest, and the sound that followed was the most beautiful thing in the room, a ragged, enormous, ugly gasp of real air tearing down an open throat, then another, then a cough so violent it shook his whole frame, then breathing, actual, sustained, oxygen-bearing breathing. The color returned to his face in stages, gray to white to a flushed, grateful red. Rosalind sat back on her heels. Her hands were shaking slightly, which she noted with detachment as a reasonable physiological response and decided she would address later, in private. She was aware that every person in the room was looking at her, including Holt himself, who was staring up at her from the floor with an expression she could not quite categorize. "Who are you?" he said, when he had enough air to form the words. She told him her name. He did not respond immediately. He turned his head and looked at Dr. Price, who had risen to his feet and was in the process of repacking his bag with slow, deliberate movements. Then Holt looked at his checkbook, which had fallen from his jacket pocket during the episode, and was lying on the carpet beside the shattered remains of a water glass. He said nothing else that evening. He let Curtis help him to the private car. He let the EMT's Price called examine him in the vehicle and declare his vitals stable. And in the morning, the word that arrived at Aurelius from the offices of Holt Capital Group was that the server who had attended the private dining salon the previous night should be informed that her assistance had been noted and that the firm's legal department would be in touch regarding the appropriate next steps. Rosalind was called into the manager's office at 10:15 on a Wednesday morning. The office smelled of espresso and the particular low-grade anxiety that permeated all restaurant management spaces during non-service hours. Her manager, Mr. Beaumont, was a man of 50 with the permanent worried expression of someone responsible for things that could go wrong in 15 different directions simultaneously. He did not look at her directly. He looked at the papers in front of him. "You understand what you did last night violated the conduct standards of this establishment," he said. "Physical contact with clientele. Intervention in a medical situation beyond your role, the disruption to a private event." Rosalind waited. Beaumont slid a folder across the desk. Inside it was a document, dense with legal language, running to 4 pages, and a check. The amount was $30,000. "Mr. Holt's legal team drafted this early this morning," Beaumont said. "It's a non-disclosure agreement covering the events of last night. You agree not to discuss what occurred in that room. Not with the press, not with your family, not publicly in any form. In exchange, Holt Capital Group is offering you a significant financial settlement." He paused. "The gentleman who sent this asked me to convey that $30,000 is a generous gesture of appreciation." Rosalind looked at the check. She thought of her mother's last infusion bill, which had arrived 2 weeks ago, and which she had put in a drawer because she could not yet figure out what to do about it. She thought of the specialist her mother needed to see in Cleveland, the one who had the most experience with late-stage pulmonary involvement in her specific condition, and the consultation fee that was not covered by insurance, and that Rosalind had been pricing quietly for 4 months. She thought of what $30,000 was in the architecture of what she actually needed. It was not enough, not by a significant margin. It did not touch the actual problem. She also thought of something else. She had heard Raymond Holt in the last moments before he lost full consciousness the previous night speak. She had been close enough that the words were clear. He had looked at Price and at the room and had said, with the wild, hypoxic absurdity of a man whose brain was depriving itself of oxygen, that he would give $1 million to whoever could actually fix him. He had laughed when he said it, but he had said it. "I won't be signing this," she said. Beaumont looked at her with the expression of a man who has been handed a problem he did not ask for. "Rosalind, these are Holt Capital Group's attorneys. You do not have the resources." "I know what resources I have," she said. She picked up her apron from the back of the chair and set it on the desk. "I'll see myself out." What happened next happened fast, in the way that financial scandals always do when the initial spark catches on dry material. A paralegal at Holt Capital Group's law firm mentioned to her boyfriend that the firm had spent the morning drafting emergency NDAs. The boyfriend worked in financial media. By Thursday afternoon, a piece appeared on a subscription investment newsletter with the headline, "Holt Capital CEO Health Scare." Sources point to chronic condition, board reportedly unaware. By Friday morning, that piece had been picked up by 3 mainstream outlets, Holt Capital Group's institutional investors, who had been managing the regulatory filings for the port acquisition for 2 months, and who had been counting on the Vaux co-signature to close the deal, began asking questions that the firm's communications team was not able to answer satisfactorily. Sterling Vaux, for his part, had returned to his hotel suite on Wednesday morning and sent a single message to his assistant. "Hold the Geneva call. I want a full medical disclosure from Holt before we proceed." The acquisition froze. The stock of the publicly traded ancillary fund Holt Capital managed dropped 11% in a single session. The board of directors scheduled an emergency call. Raymond Holt's attorney, a sharp, silver-haired woman named Ms. Ellery Strand, who had been his legal counsel for 22 years and who did not raise her voice under any circumstances, told him flatly over the phone on Friday morning that the media strategy of denial was no longer viable. Holt sat in his office on the 43rd floor of a building that bore his name on the exterior signage and stared at the security footage from the Aurelius salon that his team had obtained from the restaurant's system. He watched it 3 times. He watched the server cross the room. He watched her position herself behind him with total composure. He watched her hands. He had spent 14 months going to the finest medical institutions in the country and been told, in various sophisticated formulations, that nothing could be done. He had spent $300,000 a year on a private physician whose primary contribution to a life-threatening emergency had been to nearly put him in the ground with a contraindicated sedative. The server had fixed him in 4 seconds with her hands on a carpet. He pressed the intercom button. "Get me her name," he said to his assistant, "the server from Tuesday, and find out where she is." Rosalind was in her apartment when the call came, a Saturday morning, her one day off, spent at the kitchen table with her mother's medication schedule and a spreadsheet she updated every 2 weeks to track costs against income, against the rolling balance of what was owed, and what was deferred, and what was becoming, quietly and steadily, unmanageable. Doris was in the next room, watching a cooking program on the television that Rosalind had bought her for her birthday 2 years ago. The sound of it, the easy, cheerful noise of something normal, was a thing Rosalind anchored herself to on mornings like this one. The number was a 617 area code she did not recognize. Mrs. Faye. The voice was male, measured, with the particular quality of a person who controlled rooms for a living. "This is Raymond Holt. I understand you declined our offer." She set down her pen. "I did. Why?" She considered for a moment how to answer that. Then she decided that precision was always more useful than strategy. "Because it wasn't enough," she said, "and because you made a promise." A pause, long enough that she wondered if the call had dropped. "You were conscious for that," he said. "Not a question. I was right next to you." Another pause. "I'd like you to come to my office," he said. "Monday morning, 9 o'clock. Bring whatever you feel I should see." She arrived on Monday with a manila envelope and no attorney. The 43rd floor was all glass and pale stone, and the kind of silence that expensive buildings manufactured deliberately. Miss Strand was already in the conference room when Rosalind arrived, seated at one end of the table with a legal pad and a pen, and the expression of a woman who had seen most things and was prepared for the rest. A man from the board sat at the other end. Raymond Holt sat in the middle, directly across from the chair they gestured her toward. He looked better than he had on Tuesday. The grey undertone that she had noticed beneath his complexion was gone. He was still a large man, taking up more than his share of a room, but there was something less armored about him this morning, some quality of the previous week visible in the way he held himself. "Mrs. Faye," he said, "Dr. Price tells me what you did was reckless, that you could have caused a stroke by applying pressure in the wrong location." "He's not wrong," she said. "The margin for error is about 4 millimeters. The technique requires knowing exactly where you are anatomically." "And you knew." "I'd read the paper. I'd studied the anatomy. I'd practiced the landmark location on a model." Holt regarded her for a long moment. Why? She had known the question would come. She had thought about how to answer it. "My mother had a spasmodic episode 4 years ago with some of the same features," she said. "The paramedics managed it fine. But I had been standing there completely useless, and I decided that was the last time I was going to be useless in that situation." The board member said, carefully, "Mrs. Faye, we appreciate what you did." "But you're not a physician." "I'm aware of that. The nature of what you're suggesting. That Mr. Holt made an enforceable verbal commitment under conditions of—" "I'm not here about the enforceability," Rosalind said. She opened the manila envelope and slid a document across the table. "I'm here about this." The document was a 3-page summary she had compiled over the week, cross-referencing Holt's known medication profile, the blood pressure management protocol, and the anxiolytic regimen that Dr. Price had been managing for 14 months against a body of research on paradoxical vocal cord dysfunction and diaphragmatic myoclonus in patients with specific calcium channel and GABA receptor profiles. She had accessed the research through her old Northwestern login, which had, mercifully, not yet been deactivated. The interaction between the specific ACE inhibitor class Price favored and the long-term benzodiazepine regimen Holt had been on produced in a narrow subset of patients with a particular autonomic nervous system profile, precisely the symptoms Holt had been experiencing. It was not the original respiratory infection that had caused his episodes. The infection had been a trigger, a one-time event, but Price's subsequent medication protocol had transformed a temporary crisis into a self-perpetuating one. Every time Holt's body began to clear the pharmacological load, Price adjusted the dosage. The spasms had never had the opportunity to resolve. She watched, Holt read it. She watched his face. He looked up at Miss Strand, then at the board member, then back at the document. "How long?" he said. His voice was very quiet. "How long would it take?" "If you stopped the protocol under proper supervision," she said. "Most patients in the literature cleared within 72 to 96 hours. The structural component, the residual tissue inflammation from months of repeated spasms. Takes longer. That would require targeted treatment. But the episodes themselves, a few days. He set the document down. He pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose and was quiet for a moment. Price has been my physician for 15 years, he said. I know, she said. I'm not telling you what to do with that. He looked at Miss Strand. Get me Price's complete billing records for the last 14 months. Every prescription, every adjusted protocol, every consultation he billed to me or to the corporate account. Miss Strand was already writing. And get me on the phone with the Chief of Pulmonology at Mass General this afternoon. He turned back to Rosalind. What do you need? He asked. The question, direct and without preamble, caught her off guard in a way that the entire preceding conversation had not. She had prepared arguments. She had prepared for negotiation, for resistance, for a legal framework. She had not prepared for that particular four-word question delivered in that particular tone. My mother has a progressive autoimmune condition, she said. The specialist she needs is at the Cleveland Clinic. The consultation and the ongoing treatment protocol are not covered by our insurance. The outstanding medical debt is currently at about $60,000, with ongoing monthly costs that my current income doesn't cover. She paused. I left a pharmacology doctoral program 2 years ago because I couldn't keep both things going at the same time. I'd like to go back. Holt was quiet. He looked at the document she had given him. You put this together in a week, he said, with a dormant university login and public research access. Yes, while working restaurant shifts, I had some late nights. He was quiet for another moment. Then he looked at Miss Strand. Draft a consulting agreement, he said. Miss Faye will serve as a medical research consultant to Holt Capital for a period of 2 years. The first year's compensation will be paid as a lump sum in the amount of $1 million by wire transfer within 48 hours. Miss Strand's pen paused on the page, but only for a fraction of a second. In addition, the Holt Capital Foundation will establish a direct payment arrangement with the Cleveland Clinic for the full course of treatment for Miss Faye's mother, with no cap. And, he turned back to Rosalind, we will fund your re-enrollment in the Northwestern doctoral program, tuition and living expenses for the duration of the degree. The consulting arrangement can be structured to accommodate the academic schedule. The board member said, Raymond, the press conference is Thursday, Holt said, without looking at him. We are announcing the resolution of my health situation, the new consulting arrangement, and the Foundation's expanded medical research initiative. Sterling gets the full medical disclosure he asked for, and we reopen the acquisition conversation. He paused. This firm does not litigate against the people who save its managing partner's life. We are not that kind of operation. When Rosalind walked out of the building at noon on Monday, the September air was sharper than it had been when she went in. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. She called her mother. Doris answered on the second ring, the television still audible in the background, the cooking program, or something like it. How did it go? Rosalind thought about how to answer that in a way that would not overwhelm a woman who had already carried more than her share of difficulty, and who deserved, now, to simply receive good news without qualifications. It went well, she said. I'll explain everything tonight. Can I bring dinner? The Thursday press conference was everything Holt Capital Group's communications team had worked 60 hours in 3 days to produce. Raymond Holt stood at the podium in the firm's main conference room, flanked by the newly retained specialists from Mass General, and, somewhat unconventionally, by Rosalind Faye, who wore a grey blazer she had purchased for $40 at a consignment shop in Cambridge, and who stood with her hands clasped, and her expression composed, while Holt explained to the assembled press and investors that his health situation had been mismanaged by a former physician, that it had been identified and corrected with the assistance of a researcher he was proud to bring onto his team, and that he intended to be working without restriction for the foreseeable future. The stock recovered in the next trading session. Sterling Vaux, who had watched the press conference from his hotel room in the Back Bay, where he had remained, with characteristic patience, extended his trip. He signed the preliminary acquisition term sheet on Friday afternoon. Rosalind started at Northwestern the following January. She re-enrolled in the doctoral program in a cohort that was largely a decade younger than she was, and sat in the front row of her biochemistry seminar on the first morning, and opened her notebook and did not think about all the time that had been lost, because the time was not lost. It had been spent on something necessary, and she carried it with her as a kind of knowledge that could not be taught inside any building. Her mother's first appointment at the Cleveland Clinic was in February. The specialist there reviewed her case for 3 hours and told Doris, with the careful optimism that good physicians use with chronic illness, that there was a treatment pathway they had not yet tried, and that he was interested in pursuing it. Doris came home from that appointment and sat in her kitchen and cried, quietly, with her hands over her face, and then she made tea and turned on her cooking program, and Rosalind sat beside her and said nothing because there was nothing that needed to be said. Some debts cannot be measured in any currency that exists, and some promises, spoken into the terrified air of a room where everything has gone wrong at once, turn out to be the most consequential words a person ever means.